There was a time before you held a computer regularly in the palm of your hand. A time when gaming on the go meant something entirely different. A chance to play the license plate game if it was a car ride, or maybe play cards with the person next to you. It was a time prior to 1980 when Nintendo, a toy company unknown to most Americans, was on the brink of reinventing themselves. Reintroducing themselves as a global power was something entirely new for people interested in killing time. Here, Nintendo would introduce a series of handheld electronic games that would not only capture the hearts of millions, but also lay the groundwork for a portable gaming revolution. Today, we're winding the clock back to the origins of Nintendo's Game & Watch series, the pioneering handheld gaming devices that became a cultural phenomenon. We'll explore how this series began, we'll explore its impact on the gaming world, and we'll explore how it paved the way for future innovation in portable gaming. So grab your little gaming calculator, let's press start and get ready to play a game as we take today's trip down memory card lane. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. I hope these words find you well. Hello and welcome to the 209th episode of our video game history podcast, A Trip Down Memory Card Lane. Each week we'll tell you a story relevant to the current week in gaming history. It can be about a game or the people that have created it. It can be about a console or the technology that brought it to life. We often talk about the companies that bring it all together, making our hobby video games a reality. While telling you each story, we hope to teach you something new about the topic, what it took from the world as its inspiration, or what it gave back to the world in its legacy. Today, we are turning back the clock to the early 1980s and diving into the entirety of the Game & Watch series. First released on April 28, 1980 with the game Ball, this line of handheld electronic games marked Nintendo's first major foray into the handheld gaming market. I'm David Casson, and as always, I'm joined by my co-host, who still thinks that juggling a couple of Game & Watch units counts as exercise. He's my brother, Rob Casson. Rob, about how many Game & Watch units can you juggle at this point?
About one, Dave.
That's some talented juggling there.
Damn straight it is.
I genuinely don't know how you manage to keep it together with one whole unit.
You know, it's a tough life, but somehow I managed to make it work.
Do you toss it in the air, or do you simply pass it back and forth between your hands?
Well, guess you'll just have to watch the training video and find out, Dave.
Oh, there's a training video now, huh?
Oh, there has to be. It's a big thing to learn. Takes a lot of learning.
Now, is this training video specific to juggling Game & Watch units, or is it specific to juggling, or what?
Well, I guess you'll have to watch and find out.
Oh man, that is quite a
part
plug.
of the game.
Where can people find your training video?
At memorycardlane.com. And if you can't find it, just keep looking around. I'm sure you'll find something that interests you on the site.
Have you ever had your hands on a Game & Watch unit in your life? It can be a modern one.
I was gonna say I don't think I've ever had one of the originals, but I have played a more modernized version. Maybe I'm trying to remember if it was actually like a Game Boy version, but I remember it was there was the fireman one, and then I feel like the cook one as well, flipping the bacon, and then obviously the fireman saving the people from the building.
Those are indeed valid Game & Watch units, so can confirm you've probably had your hands on a Game & Watch unit at some point. I thought you were going to go way more modern, because for all the 35th anniversaries, they released a special edition Game & Watch for Mario and Zelda that had the Mario one has all the old Mario games on it that you could play.
Yeah, that doesn't ring a bell.
Oh well. Well, before I enlighten yourself and everyone else on the origins of the Game and Watch series, why don't you take a few moments and tell our listeners what else has happened during this current week in gaming history?
Sure thing, Dave. Kicking it off on August 30th, 1987, Capcom released Street Fighter in arcades, marking the debut of what would become one of the most iconic and influential fighting game franchises in video game history. Created by Takashi Nishiyama and Hiroshi Matsumoto, Street Fighter introduced players to the competitive world of martial arts tournaments. Players could choose to play as Ryu or Ken and compete against a series of opponents from around the world, each with unique fighting styles and special moves. While the original Street Fighter was noted for its innovative use of six-button controls and special moves, it received mixed reviews due to its difficult controls and unrefined gameplay. However, the game's concept and mechanics laid the groundwork for the highly successful sequel, Street Fighter II, which would revolutionize the fighting game genre and solidifies the series' place in gaming history. And we learned all about its development when we celebrate its 35th anniversary in episode 102. So if you want to learn more, go give it a listen.
Yes, we did. We did a whole episode on Street Fighter for its 35th. We have yet to do Street Fighter 2, but we will get there. It is definitely an iconic moment for the fighting genre. I don't know if you'll remember, Rob. It's very popular for its six button arcades, but the first versions of it had this like punch pad that like people would have to like hit, and depending on how hard they hit, they had like two pressure sensitive buttons. Depending on how hard they hit the button, that was when it did like the low, mid, high kick that, became the six buttons.
Yeah, didn't people get injured from that and that's why
They
they changed it?
sure did. They absolutely did. People were getting injured playing the game, so they had to come up with an alternative. So yes, they did.
Well, I mean, to be fair, Mario Party, Nintendo 64, there's definitely some people with scarred palms out there.
Absolutely. There's no doubt about that. You are absolutely right.
Next up, speaking of Mario, on August 27, 1992, Nintendo released Super Mario Kart for the Super Nintendo Entertainment System in Japan. Developed by Nintendo EAD, this iconic racing game introduced players to the beloved Mario Kart series, combining classic Nintendo characters with thrilling go kart racing. Super Mario Kart featured 8 characters from the Mario universe, each with unique abilities, and introduced the concept of using power ups like banana peels, shells, and stars to gain an advantage during races. The game offered several modes, including single player Grand Prix, time trials, and the competitive multiplayer battle mode, where players could race or engage in kart based combat. Super Mario Kart was praised for its innovative Mode 7 graphics, which created a pseudo 3D racing experience, and for its engaging, fun gameplay. The game's success paved the way for numerous sequels, making it one of Nintendo's most enduring and popular franchises. And we learned all about its development back in episode 104, so if you'd like to learn more, go check it out.
We sure did. We learned all about Mario Kart and told stories about when we used to play it as kids with our sister. And we learned about Mode 7, right? That that mode that allows it to look 3D, that does that 3D spinny thing around you. So it was fun.
Sure.
Yeah, 100% yes.
Yeah, I have no idea what you're talking about on that one, Dave, but I'm going to believe you.
Okay.
All right. Next up, continuing on with the SNES, on August 27th, 1994, Earthbound was released in Japan, known there as Mother 2, Gigu no Gyakushu. Developed by Ape Inc. and Hale Laboratories, and published by Nintendo, this RPG follows the adventures of a young boy named Ness and his friends as they embark on a quest to stop the evil alien Gigas from destroying the world. Earthbound is renowned for its quirky humor, contemporary setting, and unique storyline, which deviated from the traditional fantasy themes common in RPGs of the time. The game features a turn based combat system and a distinctive visual style, combining colorful, cartoony graphics with a modern day American inspired backdrop. Despite its initial commercial underperformance, Earthbound gained a dedicated fan base and critical acclaim over the years, becoming a beloved cult classic and an influential title in the RPG genre. And we learned all about it back in episode 40, so if you want to learn more, go listen.
Yes, we learned all about it and its marketing campaign, which included scratch and sniff cards that had the most awful smells. Like there was a vomit scratch and sniff card.
Yeah, I do recall that it's a horrible, horrible thought.
I know I lived it.
Yeah, you probably love that one too.
Oh yeah, it's my favorite. That and the dirty diaper one. I don't even know if there's
Oh
a dirty
yeah,
diaper one. So
wouldn't be surprised. So who knows? Maybe someone that does know can tell us.
maybe someone can for sure.
Next up, on August 25th, 2009, Batman Arkham Asylum was released for the PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360, with a Windows version following shortly thereafter. Developed by Rocksteady Studios and published by Eidos Interactive and Warner Bros. Interactive Entertainment, this action adventure game set new standards for superhero video games. Batman Arkham Asylum features a compelling storyline penned by veteran Batman writer Paul Dini, where players control Batman as he battles his way through the infamous Arkham Asylum to thwart the Joker's elaborate plan. The game was praised for its immersive atmosphere, tight combat mechanics, and intricate stealth elements, as well as its faithful representation of the Batman universe. Mark Hamill and Kevin Conroy reprised their roles as the Joker and Batman, respectively, adding to the game's authenticity. The innovative free flow combat system, detective mode, and richly detailed environments contributed to Arkham Asylum's critical and commercial success, receiving numerous awards and spawning a highly successful series.
Very good game.
What was it?
They're like some of the best some of the best superhero video games ever made.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen gameplay of at least Arkham Asylum, but I never played them myself. Last up for this week in gaming history, on August 26th, 2010, Acclaim Games officially closed its doors. The company, originally founded in 1987 as Acclaim Entertainment, had been a major player in the video game industry, known for publishing popular titles such as the Mortal Kombat series, NBA Jam, and the Turok series. After declaring bankruptcy in 2004, Acclaim Entertainment's assets were acquired, and the company was relaunched as Acclaim Games, focusing on online and social gaming. Despite efforts to adapt to the evolving gaming market, Acclaim Games struggled to regain its former prominence and was ultimately acquired by Playdom in 2010. Shortly after the acquisition, Disney, which had acquired Playdom, decided to shut down Acclaim Games, marking the end of an era for the once prominent game publisher. And with that, Dave, I think it's time to talk about today's topic.
It is needed to talk about today's topic. So, we have been here before, multiple episodes, in fact. But for those of you who are just joining us, Gunpei Yokoi was first hired by Nintendo in 1965 as a maintenance technician. The man whose job it was to keep the assembly lines in one of Nintendo's playing card, also known as Hanafuda factories, so to speak, running. That was literally his job. Oil the machines, maintain the machines, and fix them when they broke down. If you don't know, back in the 60s, Nintendo was still a playing card company. That's how they got their start in the 1800s, making playing cards, and they were still doing so into the 70s. So here they're a playing card company, and Yokoi, who has an electronic engineering degree no less, gets hired in at Nintendo as a assembly line, like a maintenance technician. And in his downtime, when the machines were actually running, Yokoi would make things, gadgets, toys, just stuff for his own amusement, stuff to pass the time. And one day, the president of Nintendo, President Yamauchi, comes to visit this assembly line, and he happened to notice one of the toys that Yokoi had made for himself. Now, this was one of those extender toys, the thing for old people like myself, where we can use it to pick up things off the ground without bending over at all. Now, Yamauchi really loved the idea, so he tasked Yokoi with turning it into a toy product in time for the next holiday season. Because, Nintendo was a toy company. They were a gaming company, I should say, but not a video game company. Is
Trading cards.
well, not really trading cards,
Oh,
playing
playing
cards.
cards. Yeah,
Yes.
yeah.
But they were a game company. They were a card company. They weren't a electronics company. They weren't a toy company in the traditional sense. They were just a card company. But playing cards are a game, so playing games was their thing. So he was asked to basically make it into a game. Now, this contraption was like this zigzaggy thing that one journalist said looked like something out of a Looney Tunes gag, the little accordion thing with the fist on the end. That's what it looked like, except instead of the fist, it was a hand that would grab things. And basically, it had two handles, and you'd pull them together, and it would accordion out. You pull them apart, and it would accordion back in. So Yokoi said, Yamauchi rather said, "Hey, I want you to turn this into a game that we can sell for the holiday season." So Yokoi worked on turning this essentially reaching tool into a game. And what he came up with was packaging it along with a set of ping pong balls and cups so that kids could have stacking competitions, basically. It was simple and incredibly successful. Nintendo ended up selling 1.4 million units of what came to be known as the Ultra Hand. With the Ultra Hand success, Yamauchi founded a new research and development decision within Nintendo, and he put Yokoi in charge. So now he's a department head, no longer a maintenance technician. And for the next decade or so, Yokoi became Nintendo's bread and butter, with that research division, with him at the helm, producing toy upon toy upon toy for Nintendo. It was over this decade that Nintendo evolved from a playing card company into a toy company, essentially. There were toys like a baseball throwing machine that they called the Ultra Machine. There was a love tester where you and another person would grab it and it would tell you if you were in love with one another. There was a mechanical driving game. There was an extendable periscope. They made low cost knockoff Lego bricks. There were puzzles like the 10 million barrel puzzle, I remember one of them. And there was even a remote controlled vacuum cleaner. Roomba, eat your heart out. Because you were not the first. You may have been the first that controlled yourself, but there was a remote control vacuum way back when, which is like the grandpa of Roomba, basically.
Had no idea. That's kind of interesting.
Isn't that fascinating?
I don't know how it would make. I guess. I mean, yeah. What would be the remote control? Was it a long remote control, or what would be the
No,
purpose?
no, no. It was like a little RC car that doubled as a vacuum. Like, well, I mean, it looks like it
Oh,
looks round. I mean, it looks
so it's
closer to a
gotcha.
Roomba, but it's literally you just have a controller and you tell the vacuum where to go, and it's also a vacuum. So, literally remote control vacuum. It looks closer to a Roomba than it does a vacuum for sure. So one of the parts of Yokoi's career, the next part of his career, is something that we visited in detail in a few different episodes, and that was his creation of the laser clay system. That was his, along with some other people's, first attempt at using the light gun technology that is most famously recognized as part of the NES Zapper, the light gun, the Zapper, that was with the Nintendo in the 1980s. in the beginning, here in the 70s, the laser clay system, Nintendo would famously buy bowling alleys that were left empty. After World War II and the rebuilding phase of Japan, after the war into the rebuilding phase, a lot of American soldiers stayed in Japan for various reasons, and then they left. And bowling was very much an American thing, and so the void left by all these soldiers leaving emptied out a lot of bowling alleys. And Nintendo's idea with Yokoi was to take their new technology, this light gun technology, buy these bowling alleys and to turn them into virtual skeet shooting ranges. And they did. And for a while, it was a good idea. And then in 1973, there was a global oil crisis. And insanely high oil prices trickled into high gas prices, and that affected the cost of transporting goods. So suddenly there was either a shortage of goods or an insane price increase on what was left. So basically, the cost of everything became insane, and people were just trying to survive because the cost of everything is stupid. And when that happens, entertainment goes way, way, way down the list, right?
Yeah, very true.
So any interest in these skeet shooting ranges pretty much dwindled. People weren't going out to do anything, let alone, a newfangled technology like that. And when people stopped going out to do things, not only were they not going to Nintendo's skeet shooting ranges, but there were other people, other arcade owners and bowling alley owners and so on and so forth that had ordered the laser clay system, and they canceled all of their orders. So Nintendo had all this now money tied up in that technology. They had all this money tied up in real estate that was useless to them now. And as a result, Nintendo found themselves billions of yen in debt, something like 5 billion yen in debt as a result of the laser clay system. And this was a hole that would literally take them the better part of the next decade, so to speak, to dig out of. Kinda. Yeah, about a decade. It was about a decade. 1980 roughly is when they started to turn it around. So it was in this context, right? Yokoi had made all of these really great toys, all these really great ideas. He had made Nintendo, win after win after win after win. And then, Nintendo's looking to get into arcades. And the early 70s is kind of when electromechanical arcades are taken off and Pong is around. And they decide to try their hand to laser clay system, and it pretty much fails, costing them a lot of money. So we've got all this stuff going on. But Nintendo's not really giving up, right? Because the laser clay system became other things. We know that in a year later, roughly, is when they made their first video game console, the Color TV game, which was made by a completely different division. But here, a year later in 1974, Yokoi is sitting on a bullet train, something that we really don't have here in the United States.
Very true.
And he sees a bored businessman playing with an LCD calculator, just playing with it, randomly pressing buttons, probably spelling out the word boobs like every one of us does on an LCD calculator. I mean, what else do you do on a calculator, right?
Um, Math.
Math. But that's not what he saw. He saw a guy randomly pressing buttons to pass the time, bored on a train. And when he saw this, he got an idea. He thought that there was room for a watch that could also double as a miniature gaming machine to pass the time. So Yokoi is sitting at his desk, thinking about his idea, when the head of human resources comes to him with a rather unusual request, right? Yamauchi, the president of Nintendo, his boss, had a meeting downtown, but Yamauchi's chauffeur had come down with the flu. And there was only one other person in the company who knew how to drive the president's car, which was an American car. It had its steering wheel on the left, which was unusual for a Japanese vehicle. And there were only two people in the company apparently that knew how to drive it. There was the chauffeur, and there was Gunpei Yokoi, who learned to drive it when he was on business meetings, obviously to the states. So he was, as the only other person that could, asked to drive Yamauchi to the meeting. And at first, Yokoi was offended by the request, right? Here he was, a department head, being asked to drive his boss around. Certainly, there are better things he could be doing with his time. That is a very expensive driver, right? But there was no refusing. That's that culture, right? When your boss asks something of you, you do it. That is very much ingrained into their business culture. So Yokoi swallowed his pride and he jumped into the driver's seat. And while driving, it came to him that Yamauchi was sitting in the back seat of his car, the car, and he had absolutely no choice but to listen to him. So he wouldn't have to go through the normal channels of, going to his secretary and getting a meeting on the schedule and then taking the time for a meeting and then pitching at the meeting. He wasn't going to have to do any of that. Instead, he had Yamauchi cornered in this car, and he was going to take the opportunity to pitch this idea to President Yamauchi, right?
Hey, that's one way to get it done.
That is one way to get it done. So he mentions to him, if we can make a game machine as small and thin as a calculator, salaried men can play games without getting busted. That was the pitch.
It's kind of a scary pitch when you think about it. Salary men, like that could mean, hey, so you want your employees to have something that they can do while at work instead of working.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Exactly. So Yokoi is driving and throwing this pitch out. And it's clear that Yamauchi is listening, but he doesn't show any interest whatsoever. He doesn't give him anything. He just listens. And then moves on with his day, goes to his meeting. Now, what Yokoi didn't know, what there was no way that Yokoi could have possibly known, was that the meeting that he had driven Yamauchi to included the CEO of Sharp, the electronic company, who at the time was the world's largest manufacturer of calculators.
Well,
So,
that was convenient.
right? So, at this meeting, Yamauchi pitches the idea of a calculator sized game to the CEO of Sharp. And much to Yokoi's surprise, about a week later, Yamauchi calls him into his office. And he steps in and he finds Yamauchi and an executive from Sharp in there. Yamauchi says, "You want to make a calculator sized game machine? Sharp's good at that, so I called them over." And so Yokoi worked together with Sharp to create just that. Exactly that. It was a little device about the size of a 3x5 card with a small LCD screen. It was powered by a little 4-bit Sharp computer, the same thing some of their watches use, with a whopping 792 bytes of ROM and RAM for data storage. A very tiny, unsophisticated piece of electronics.
I mean, hey, but it got the job done.
Did it though?
Uh, I would think so.
They give the device a name that reflects the dual functionality of its design. Okay. It was a single game paired with a digital clock on an LCD screen, aka a watch. Hence, it became the Game & Watch, poised to revolutionize handheld gaming and the world. Rob, do you know what else has revolutionized the world?
What's that, Dave?
Podcasting. It has changed the way that people spend their time, changed the way that people listen to the news, changed the way that people listen to information about their favorite video games. But do you, dear listeners, have something that you would like to add to the mix? If you've ever considered starting your own podcast but don't know where to begin, our friends at Zencaster have got you covered. Zencaster offers an all in one podcasting suite of tools that makes it easier than ever to create high quality podcasts.
With Zencaster, it's super easy to record a podcast. Everyone logs in using their web browser, and you start recording right away. It even allows you to record in up to 4K video with your guests, and with Zencaster's multi-layered backups, you always have the highest quality recordings, even if your connection is unstable.
And the best part, my opinion, the best part, Zencaster's post production process makes you sound buttery smooth. It automatically removes all those ums and ahs, eliminates awkward pauses. You can set the right podcast loudness, you can reduce background noise, all with just a single click of a button.
So if you'd like to start your own podcast or take your current podcast to the next level, go to zencaster.com/pricing and use the code MemoryCardLane for 30% off your first month of any Zencaster paid plan.
Sign up for Zencaster today, and you can experience the same ease of producing your own high quality podcast. Go out and give the people something new to listen to. So, the very first Game & Watch device was released on April 28th, 1980, and it's called Ball. When it came stateside, it was renamed to Toss Up. The object of Ball is really simple. You throw balls in the air and you catch them. So you're basically juggling with more than one ball, might I add, Rob. I don't think it's actually juggling with one unit, but I'm just throwing that out there.
That's part of the interest and why you got to go check out the website, Dave.
The Game & Watch unit is very simple. It has an LED screen with 3 buttons underneath that say Game A, Game B, and Time. Game A, Game B were different difficulties. And on each side of the screen was a single button labeled left and right, controls by which you either move your character left or right. I should add that in North America, the Game & Watch line was originally released through the Mego Corporation as the Timeout series. When they first came stateside, Nintendo was still a relatively unknown company, and we kind of talked about that with the Famicom, the story of the Nintendo Famicom. People were really distrustful of foreign companies, Japanese companies, not specifically, but among them. And so when they first brought this stateside, they did not do it as the Nintendo Game & Watch. They did it as the Mego Timeout, as a side note. Oh, and if you're a fan of old stuff, the Video Game History Foundation recently published, they got their hands on the first commercial of the Mego Timeout, and they were able to get it restored and published on their website, their blog, which means you can technically see the very first Nintendo commercial stateside by looking at the Mego Timeout commercial.
Neat. Didn't know that was a thing.
It is very neat. So you have this very basic device, right? And, it's just you move your character left, you move it right to catch a ball, throw it back in the air, juggle a ball, juggle 2 balls with different speed depending on the game A, game B, stuff like that. And Ball was the first Game & Watch device. It was the first in what we now call the Silver Series. 5 versions of the Game & Watch device, each with different games that were released during the 1980s. Ball was one of them. The other titles, you're familiar with at least one of them. They were Flagman, Vermin, The Exterminator, Fire, and Judge. And to sum up kind of what they were, Flagman was kind of like Simon Says. It was pattern matching with flags, so you had to match whatever the flag guy did on the screen. Vermin, the Exterminator, was whack-a-mole. Fire was the one you were familiar with, Rob, where you control 2 firemen who are holding a trampoline. In it, you basically have people jumping out of a burning building. You had to bounce them into a waiting ambulance. And Judge was basically a number guessing game. So you would go against the computer, and you each held up a hammer, gavel, and with a number, and the highest number wins. So that's it. It's kind of like playing Go Fish, I guess. So that was the first bunch. That was the 1980 bunch. They were very simple, basic screen. They were plastic cases that had like a silver overlay on the front, hence the Silver Series. And that was how we introduced Game and Watch to the world. So the next year, in 1981, in early 1981, there were 3 Game and Watch models released. They were all part of now what we now call the Gold Series. They had a gold overlay, and they include Manhole, Helmet, and Lion. In Manhole, basically you would have people walking across a screen, multi-leveled, and you would have to hold a manhole up to cover gaps, in the street so people could walk across the screen. Helmet had you dodging tools that are falling from the sky. And then Lion, you are a lion tamer, and your job is to prevent a lion from escaping its cage. The Gold Lion was quickly replaced, not replaced, but they added to it the widescreen series, which, as advertised, has wider LCD screens than the earlier models. And there are probably more widescreen units than anything, if I remember correctly. There are 10 different widescreen units that released between 1981 and 1982. It was during the widescreen Game & Watch era that Nintendo got into the business of making licensed Game & Watch models. So among these 2 units are Popeye, Mickey Mouse, and Snoopy Tennis. Now, Popeye has you catching things to throw by Olive Oil, his girlfriend, while avoiding attacks from Bloodle. I realize now that these are all words that probably mean nothing to a generation that has probably never seen Popeye, because there hasn't been a Popeye anything in, 20 years, 30 years?
That's probably about right. Yeah. Well, no, there was.
Robin Williams made one in the 80s, so 40
Was
years.
it really that long?
I believe it was the 80s, yes.
Holy shit.
If I'm not, you're gonna look it up and tell me I'm wrong.
I swear that there was a movie more recent than that.
Maybe.
I just, but maybe it was the Robin Williams ones that I'm thinking of.
The Mickey Mouse, was I right about the 80s?
Yeah, it was 1980.
The Mickey Mouse Game & Watch has Mickey Mouse catching eggs as they rode on a slope. Don't know why that's a Mickey Mouse game, but it is. There is also Snoopy Tennis, which kind of speaks for itself, right? It's a tennis game. There's also Parachute. There's Octopus. Rob, you had mentioned playing Chef, which is part of the widescreen line. There is Egg. They re-released the Fire one. There's Turtle Bridge, and there is Fire Attack. So they're just going off the chain with the widescreen series. And it was popular. Many of the widescreen models sold over 1 million units. So Yokoi and his team were encouraged to continue to make models in the Game & Watch line, right? If you get to sell a million, of course you're going to. In fact, I think that first year, the 1980 to 1981, they sold 14 million Game & Watch devices altogether. So we're not talking like this is a little phenomenon. We're talking this is a big phenomenon. This is like arguably the first time Nintendo has a global hit on their hands. As they're making more Game & Watch models, they are thinking of ways to evolve, right? We went from the Silver Series, the Gold Series, and now we have widescreen LCDs. So as the technology is getting better with LCD screens and everything, they're thinking of ways to improve the Game & Watch line itself. And so their next innovation in mid 1982, they start releasing models in what we now call the vertical multi-screen series, and they're designed exactly as they sound. They have 2 screens, one on the top, one on the bottom. It is a clamshell design, so you fold it open, screen on top, screen at bottom. In fact, if you were to look at it, I'm assuming most of our audience is going to be pretty modern. They look like a very rudimentary Nintendo DS. And that is a great way to describe them because the team that designed the Nintendo DS actually took direct inspiration from the Game & Watches to create that design. If you want to think about what a vertical multi-screen is, just think about the DS. In 1981, as this is all happening, right, Nintendo had just released Donkey Kong in arcades. And we've had an episode on Donkey Kong. We recently talked about it again in our Nintendo Famicom episode not too long ago. If you don't know it, and you better know it at this point, Donkey Kong was an absolute hit. Because it's mixed in with the Game & Watch line, there's some argument over if it's Nintendo's first global mega hit or if the Game & Watch line is. But there are some things we absolutely know, right? It catapults Shigeru Miyamoto into the spotlight, who designed it and the characters. It is a global mega hit. Whether or not it's the first or Game & Watch is the first, that's arguable, but it's a global mega hit. Those two are very much responsible for increasing Nintendo's brand recognition exponentially. And Donkey Kong is largely responsible for filling Nintendo's coffers. It basically earned it back all of that money it lost on the laser clay system and then some. It ended up, if I remember correctly, Nintendo's excess after Donkey Kong was something in the excess of 50 million yen, if not more. Like, it just absolutely was a game changer for Nintendo. That was all the money, if you'll recall, that Nintendo used to develop the Nintendo Famicom, the NES, which absolutely changed the world. And we talked about that in a few episodes ago, like 202, 203, somewhere in there. So if you want to learn about how the Famicom changed the world, give that a listen. Oh, 203. See, Rob, it's in my notes. I just didn't look hard enough.
Wow, look at you go.
I know, right? So when they were deciding on titles to develop for the vertical multi-screen line, they knew that they had to capitalize on the popularity of Donkey Kong, and they wanted to bring that smash hit into the Game & Watch line. But Donkey Kong is an arcade cabinet with a joystick that moved in all four directions and needed to move in all four directions, right? Because you could jump over you could jump, you could duck. There were places that you had to have all four movements. Every Game & Watch up until this point really just had that single button, one on the left to move left, one on the right to move right. But now you have four directions that are needed. And you have this clamshell design, right? Think of the DS and how it opens and closes. And you can't exactly put a joystick that sticks out of the device in order to close the clamshell, right? Can't do it. So, in order to design useful controls, they had to go back to the drawing board. And it was Yokoi himself who gets the credit with designing a useful control scheme that was mostly designed so it could sit flush in the clamshell and still be useful for players to navigate with all four directions. And that is the infamous, we call it the D-pad, right? The directional pad. And the directional pad, the up, down, left, right, is still pretty much found on every single controller today, is it not? I mean, it's on the Xbox, it's on the Switch, it's on the PlayStation controllers. There's a D-pad on everything nowadays.
Yeah, that's fair. I'm trying to think of something that doesn't have it controller wise, and yeah, I can't.
So the D-pad, or directional pad, was seen for the first time on the Game & Watch version of Donkey Kong, which was released on June 3rd, 1982. So remember that. The birthday of the D-pad is June 3rd, 1982. Now, including Donkey Kong, there were 12 vertical multi-screen units released. They include Oil Panic, Mickey and Donald, Greenhouse, Donkey Kong 2, Pinball, Blackjack, Squish, Bomb Sweeper, Safe Buster, Gold Cliff, and there was one simply called Zelda. We call these vertical multi-screens to distinguish them from another series developed later on called horizontal multi-screens that were side-by-side screens. There were three of those. They delivered games such as Mario Brothers, Rain Shower, and Lifeboat. So as these are coming out, all of these are coming out, the team is just making new models left and right, mixing up the styles of Game & Watch releases. All of these vertical multi-screens and were made between 82 and 89, for instance. The horizontals were made in the middle there. In October of 1982, Nintendo begins to release updated versions of their widescreen models. They're called the newer widescreens. They are games such as Donkey Kong Jr., Mario's Cement Factory, Manhole, Tropical Fish, Super Mario Brothers, Climber, Balloon Fight, and Mario the Juggler. Some fun ones in there.
Yeah.
Mario Cement Factory, arguably one of the lesser known Mario games.
I mean, it's like the best one.
It is. If you don't know, Mario Cement Factory puts you in control of Mario, who works at a cement factory, and your job is to funnel cement into cement trucks. You have to navigate these dangerous elevators, you have to avoid falling as a result of them or being crushed by them, and you kind of have to continuously empty cement into the trucks, or the cement overflows and then crushes workers that are down at the bottom of the screen, which also costs you a life. So Mario was not just a plumber, he also spent some time in a cement factory before he was a small business owner. Mario the Juggler pretty much plays the same way as the first Game & Watch. Ball just has Mario instead of Mr. Game & Watch. During this time period, Coleco, one of their main competitors, had started to make these tabletop versions of games for people. There was a Pac-Man little arcade cabinet, for instance. So, of course, to compete, Nintendo starts to make their own quote-unquote tabletop games. They look like little arcade cabinets. They're literally called the Game & Watch Tabletop Series. They turned Donkey Kong Jr., Mario Cement Factory, Snoopy, and Popeye into tabletop versions. They had these really cool ones called the panorama models. They basically had a screen with a mirror that flipped up, and together it would reflect the screen in front of you. So it's kind of like a mini projector that was projecting the screen in front of you. It was a super cool technology for its time, very unique. And they, again, remade some popular games into panorama models like Snoopy, Popeye, and Donkey Kong Jr. You also have one called Mario Bombs Away, which literally has Mario dropping bombs on enemies, and one called Donkey Kong Circus, which was the same as Mickey Mouse, just had Donkey Kong collecting the eggs and not Mickey Mouse. And then there was also the Super Color series. They were LCD screens, large LCD screens with color overlays. There were two of those, Spitball, Sparky, and Crab Grab. In 1984, they got even more creative. They released 3 Game & Watch models in what's known as the Micro Versus line. There was a boxing, and when it came to the States, it was Punch-Out versus. There was Donkey Kong 3 and Donkey Kong Hockey, and they basically look like little pucks with a screen on it, and coming out of the pucks are really tiny, even smaller puck controllers. So, they were all 2-player games that you would sit with a friend and play on these tiny handheld things. And then in 1986, there were 3 models released with crystal LCD screens called the Crystal Screen series. They were Super Mario Brothers, Climber, and Balloon Fight, all popular games on the NES. Fun fact, there is a 4th Crystal Screen model that was only released as a prize for the Famicom's F1 Grand Prix tournament, which was held on August 1st, 1987. It is a version of the Crystal Screen Super Mario Brothers, but it is cast in a yellow case. It's the only yellow case version of Crystal Super Mario Brothers. They never sold it at retail. It was only given out at a prize at this tournament. It's not like a tiny number like 2 or 3. They gave out 10,000 at this tournament, but that's still a small number compared to the millions that were sold otherwise. And so that makes this easily the most rare of the Game & Watch models. So if you ever see a yellow Game & Watch device, it is incredibly rare.
All right. Good to know.
Now, I should say that, because that's kind of the tail end of Game & Watch, it was always a success. In its first year, like I said, 1981, it had sold 14 million units. But by the end of its run, which was 1991, it sold about 43.4 million units worldwide. They sold a lot of Game & Watch units. They were basically selling like hotcakes until the Nintendo Game Boy became a thing that year. Nintendo really does consider it to be their first worldwide successful video game product. Though again, some of us argue that Donkey Kong is in the mix. probably very close behind it. I mean, Game and Watch did come out a year before Donkey Kong, so it's a valid argument. But they kind of both spread their wings to the world along the same time, I would argue. But it's semantics at that point. But in the Game and Watch line, we have both the legacy of handheld gaming and the legacy of controller design that are both still seen to this day. Whether or not you are intimately familiar with the Game and Watch line, it's hard to deny the fact that it's an incredibly important part of video game history. Like I said in the beginning, Rob, occasionally you still see them. In 2020, when Mario turned 35, and in 2021, when Zelda turned 35, they came out with anniversary, like limited editions of Game and Watch lines that were Mario and Zelda. And like the Mario one had Super Mario Brothers and Mario the Lost Levels. Probably had all the NES Marios on an actual like LCD screen, like not not like Game and Watch. Like it looked like a little handheld like game like Nintendo DS, for instance, legitimate LCD screen. And they did the same with Zelda in 2021. They're actually really sharp, like gold cases, really nice. That play these old games.
That's pretty neat, but I had no idea.
Great collectors. If you see them, they're buy them if they're a reasonable price because they didn't make a lot of them too. But that's it. Between the I would argue that this is again an incredibly important device in gaming history because if anything, yes, it started handheld gaming, but even beyond that, it gave us a directional pad, which is synonymous with gaming to this day. Absolutely synonymous with gaming, and still found in every single video game controller that doesn't try to be. I can't even say that. I wanted to say it doesn't try to be weird like the Wii, but the Wii controllers even had a D-pad on them, right? Because you could turn them sideways. You could do that with the Switch controllers, right? You could turn them sideways and use the D-pad like a normal controller for the NES on the Nintendo store. You know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely.
So the D-pad is on literally every controller. Every controller. Heck, my freaking Quest, which is my virtual reality headset, it has a D-pad on one of the controllers too. A D-pad is just synonymous with video gaming, and it got its start with the Game and Watch line. So this is one of those like essential pieces of video game history. And there's a lot of video game history. Just in this episode alone, we talked about other parts of Yokoi's career. He eventually went on to do the Game Boy. He did the laser clay system. These are all in episodes we visited before. In the beginning, we talked about Street Fighter. We talked about Super Mario Kart. We talked about Earthbound. These are all games that we did episodes on. And of course, if you'd like to check out old episodes of our podcast, you can do so wherever you listen to your podcasts or by going to our website at www.memorycardlane.com. Rob, what else can people do by going to our website?
You can find a calendar of our upcoming episodes for the year. You can find a link to our Discord where you can come hang out with Dave and I. You can find a link to our Patreon where you can get access to ad-free and unedited versions of our podcasts, like the versions where Dave is shitting himself. And you can also find links to our social medias where I am on several platforms as Rob_O_Raptor and Dave.
This was a nice, clean episode until you did that. I could have edited everything out, but I can't edit that out. I can be found on various platforms as David is Wrong. Each week, ladies and gentlemen, we'll tell you one story relevant to the current week in gaming history. It can be about a game, a console, a technology, just something that I've deemed relevant to this week's publication date in gaming history. And while doing so, we hope to teach you something new about the game, topic, what it took from the world as its inspiration, or what it gave back to the world in its legacy. Every week when we sit down to do another episode and research our topic, the goal is what fun new stuff can we find out that we didn't know before. And we can take that fun stuff and we can teach our listeners something new that they didn't know before. It's a fantastic cycle of learning and teaching. And in recognition of that cycle, we like to go roundtable and talk about our takeaways each week. So, Rob, what did you learn today?
Well, I think the craziest thing for me is knowing that it was Game and Watch that brought about the directional pad. That's pretty influential and pretty crazy to know that something I just wouldn't have thought it came from this. I would have thought it would have been a console or something. But pretty cool that it came from Game and Watch. And I also think it's kind of coincidental and kind of cool that it all started because you had to drive the president to a meeting that
Yeah,
just so happened to be with a calculator manufacturer that would create the first one.
yeah,
Like, what are the chances, you know?
yeah. It's hard sometimes because like you think about the what ifs. Would it have happened if he it wasn't that meeting, right? Like maybe might have happened. Maybe it would have been later, but maybe it would have been too late because another company would have jumped on it faster. Or you just never know. But yeah, it's a lot of really great coincidences that have made this happen. But we've kind of visited on that. We've touched on that in other stories, right? There are all these little fun, and that's the kind of stuff that we like to pick out when we do these stories every week. There are a lot of fun coincidences in gaming that make you go, hmm. Well, if he wasn't there in that moment at that time, maybe this would have never happened, and we wouldn't have this game or this series, or this person wouldn't be known as one of the top video game designers. There's a lot of these really interesting what ifs within these stories, and no doubt that that is one of them for sure. So
Most definitely. So those are my takeaways for the week. How about yourself, Dave?
I really, I've I've never really paid attention to the story. So like you, I'm really interested by the fact that again, like you, he went to the meeting with the sharp person. Coincidentally, and it made it happen. But also, I had never really known that there were so many different versions of Game and Watch models, because I know Game and Watch as like the ball one, just these little 3x5 handheld screens with a button to go left and a button to go right. Like that's, and then maybe the ones with a D-pad too. I'm not going to deny that I don't know those exist, but some of the weird ones, like the Versus system, the panorama ones, the tabletop ones, I had zero idea those really existed. So it was fun getting to dive into the Game and Watch line and see all these weird variations of Game and Watch models. That I would really encourage you to kind of go online, Google, and check out, because like the panorama ones in particular are kind of cool because they're like literally like you're not looking at the screen, you're looking at a projection, from mirrors when you look at it, and so it's this very unique view basically. That's a lot of fun. So that's my takeaway.
Yeah, I honestly didn't realize there were so many either, and it sounds like they had some pretty novel ideas.
They did, until they had one that was even more novel in the Game Boy. So
I mean, yeah, true. But hey, Game and Watch, the first of many.
it did. It started the revolution. All right, Rob. Well, before I take it out of here and lean into next week, is there anything else that you'd like to add to today's episode?
Just want to take a quick moment to say thank you so much to everyone for listening. It means the world to us to have you along with us as we learn about games and watch how they took place. So thank you.
Yes, indeed. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Well, that wraps up our deep dive into the creation of the Game and Watch series and its pioneering role in the world of handheld gaming. We hope that you've learned something about how the design of these little Nintendo devices still influences gaming to this day. Next week, though, we're putting the handhelds aside and we're stepping back into the living room itself for a look at one of the most important consoles in history, the Atari 2600. We'll explore how this iconic system brought video games into our homes, briefly look at some of the unforgettable games it introduced, and talk about the profound impact that it had on the entire gaming industry. So if you thought the Game and Watch was literally a game changer, just wait till next week as we rewind to the golden age of home consoles. Join us as we plug in the joysticks and relive the good old days of home gaming on yet another trip down memory card lane. Do the thing.
Skibidi dap 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 doo